Without further ado, I am going to turn things over to our speaker today, Jana Burke, the President of Mariposa Professional Services. Jana?
Thank you very much, Nancy. I do appreciate you moderating the session today. I also want to take just a second to thank TransCen as well as the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center for allowing me to participate in your webinar series. It's great to be online with everyone. And I do hope that all of the participants out there are managing well in this time of great challenge, if nothing else. So hopefully we can spend the next hour and a half together and burn some of our time while many of us are at home under stay-at-home orders. Today we're going to be talking about a very narrow topic, or we're going to be doing a deep dive, I should say, into a topic under Title I, or the Employment Provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Primarily the topic of essential job functions and the role that job descriptions and job analysis can play in your organization's overall disability law compliance, as well as inclusion efforts within your organization. So today what we're going to do is introduce the ADA Title I employment provisions on slide 10 that are related to both essential and marginal job functions. And in doing that, we're going to understand the importance and the utility of those for the activities that you're doing in order to be in compliance with the ADA, as well as inclusive of workers with disabilities within your organization. Then we'll chat a little bit about job analysis strategies that you can use for identifying those essential job functions, and also evaluate common strategies for developing ADA-compliant, quote-unquote, job descriptions. And we'll talk a little bit about words that you can use in your job descriptions so that you won't have an issue, or that so that you can work on making sure that you're not excluding, whether inadvertently or advertently, individuals with disabilities from jobs within your organization. So on slide 11, we're going to do a very quick dive into an overview of the essential job functions. So slide 12, as many of you know, in order to be protected under the employment provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act, not only do you need to be an individual with a disability that falls into one of the three prongs of the definition of disability under the law, you also need to be considered a qualified individual with a disability. And what that means is that you're able to satisfy the skill, experience, education, and any other job-related requirements that an organization may have for a specific position. And we'll dive a little bit deeper into that in just a moment. In order to be considered qualified, you also need to be able to perform the essential functions of the position with or without,
has joined the conference.
With or without reasonable accommodation. We're not going to spend too much time, or any time, quite honestly, talking about accommodation today. That's an entirely different topic. But it's important to remember that we make sure that we are providing those reasonable accommodations to our applicants and employees with disabilities to allow them the equal opportunities to participate in employment and the employment process. General rule of thumb for the Americans with Disabilities Act, however, is that an employer is never required to either hire or retain an individual who is not qualified to perform a job, regardless if that individual has a disability or not. So, in order to be covered, just to recap, under the employment provisions of Title I of the ADA, you need to, 1, be an individual with a disability or fall under one of those three prongs of the definition. You satisfy the skill, experience, education, and all of those other job-related requirements, and you can perform the essential functions of the job with or without accommodation. So what are essential functions? On slide 13, I would love to give you guys a very scientific definition of an essential job function. Unfortunately, it just doesn't exist. And if you get into the guidance material and you start to do a little bit of research and into this topic, you'll notice some language that often gets used and adopted when discussing essential job functions. And what that language is that it's the fundamental duties of an employment position. Basically, why that position exists. What work does that position do within an organization that it was created in the first place? Again, nothing scientific, but it is those core fundamental duties why a position exists. It's not going to include marginal or peripheral functions, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Let's be honest, for all of us on the call today, we have a lot of different job duties. There are a few core things that we do, and then there's a bunch of extra other duties as assigned, so to speak, that often get tagged and lumped into our job duties. Oftentimes, all of those extra duties as assigned or the extra things that we get out of a position are going to be considered those marginal or peripheral job functions. Despite what your managers are telling you, very important to keep in mind that all job functions in a position are not essential job functions. It is a very rare instance, if even possible ever an instance, where you have a job description or a position where all of the job functions and job duties that are listed would be considered essential. The other key component of essential functions to keep in mind is that when we're talking about these, and we'll spend some time delving into this a little bit more, we're talking about specifying what job task needs to be done, not how that job task or that duty should be performed. So it's what, not how. So for example, the classic job duty that a lot of folks want to talk about when we're dealing with this topic is the ability to lift. Lifting is often viewed as a job duty that is assigning a how to the task. Because the fact of the matter is, in most jobs, the task is actually to move material from point A to point B, whether it's boxes, reams of paper, office supplies, furniture, produce if you work in a grocery store. You're moving something from point A to point B. You can do that through lifting. You can lift the item, carry it across a certain piece of floor, and put it down. That is prescribing how that task should be done. But the core fundamental duty is that you're trying to move or locate something from point A to point B. So we'll dive a little bit deeper into that, but it's very important that as we get into designing a quote-unquote ADA compliant job description, that we're sticking with language that describes what needs to be done, not how we as the employer want the employee to perform that task. So for an example, let's dive in a little bit and then talk about some very specific examples. The classic example that the EEOC adopted and has been using for several years, pretty much since they published the Title I Technical Assistance Manual, is the idea of the mail clerk. So you have a position that the fundamental duties, the essential functions, are processing incoming and outgoing mail for an organization. That individual, manages incoming and outgoing mail. They distribute it within the organization. They process it through the postal service or other shipping service, et cetera, et cetera. A very basic position that a lot of us can understand. In one organization, it just so happens that the mail clerk also provides backup support to the office receptionist when that person is either on break, vacation, or out sick. So this is an extra marginal duty that they've assigned to this position to allow some redundancy within the organization and coverage for other positions. However, if you have someone who is deaf and is unable to answer a standard switchboard telephone, but can still perform the essential function of the job, which is processing the incoming and outgoing mail for the company, that individual would still be considered qualified even though they could not perform the job tasks associated with the receptionist position backup. So as an employer, we would need to consider that consider that applicant and look at their qualifications to see if they're the best candidate for the job because they can perform the essential functions. And then we would need to figure out who we could assign that marginal task to because they're otherwise qualified for the position. In terms of developing or doing job analysis and developing job descriptions, then you take the next step, and as an organization, you can assign preferred skills or how you want someone in this position to do the job. So for example, for a mail clerk, you'd like someone who can complete tasks by managing their priorities, self-motivating, working well under deadlines, working well with others, those kinds of preferences. So the what of the job task, the essential, is processing the incoming and outgoing mail. The what in the marginal job function is providing that backup to the receptionist. How we'd like that done is with the ability to manage priorities, self-motivate, and work well under deadlines. As another example on slide 15, you have a firefighter position, and this is a simplification of a firefighter because I do know for many of you that work in Title II and in state and local government, there are different levels of firefighter, et cetera, et cetera. But for purposes of today's webinar, let's take it to the basic level and just say a firefighter position. The essential job task or the essential function, the what that this position is required to do, is respond to fire alarms, medical emergencies, hazardous materials, urban rescue, and other calls to protect life and property. So that is the core fundamental duty. There's a lot of activities that fall under that category. Obviously, when you're responding to a fire alarm, there's a lot of activity that follows that response. But the essential function is being able to respond to protect life and property. A marginal task that's also often assigned to firefighters is to be able to participate in fire station housekeeping, since so many of firefighters are usually on shift work and are essentially in residence at the fire station during their shift. And so there's an expectation to share some of that housekeeping duty. In some municipalities and in some courts, quite honestly, the decision has been made that participating in that fire station housekeeping can be seen as a marginal job task, something that's peripheral to those main core duties of protecting life and property. So the essential function, the what, is that responsiveness. The marginal task, the what, is doing the housekeeping. How a municipality or a fire department would prefer someone to perform those tasks would be, for example, working under strict discipline, remaining calm in hazardous high-stress situations, interacting effectively with the public. That's another common preferred skill that we see in job descriptions or position summary statements for firefighters. So just as another example, this is how you can break it down to be sure that you're focusing on the what versus the how. So as an organization, is it okay for those of us as employers to quantify our job duties? For example, if you're in a manufacturing setting, is it okay to require that individuals who work on the floor and process shipments for distribution complete a certain number of boxes in a shift? The short answer is yes. Quantifiable essential job functions are permissible under the Americans with Disabilities Act as long as they're actually necessary and required for the position. Again, they also need to actually be imposed on employees. So it's one thing to have something in print, but if in practice the organization is not holding individuals that are in that position to those performance standards, you can't suddenly do that with an employee with a disability and show that as an employer you're being consistent and you're imposing these on employees across the board. You also can adopt production levels that screen out or tend to screen out candidates with disabilities. So by making, it's important that you quantify these tasks in a way that's reasonable and humanly possible, quite honestly, versus setting standards that are unrealistic and high enough that no one can reach, or individuals, entire categories of individuals with certain types of disabilities are unable to perform the task. So for example, if you're in a retail setting and you have a cashier position, you want to make sure that if you have a quantifiable essential job function, which is provide customer service to a certain number of customers per hour, that you're taking into account the fact that transactions can take varying amounts of time, that your store can be busier at certain times than others. So you need to take all of those factors into play when you're coming up with these quantifiable production standards, because that's the reality. And so again, if those tend to screen out individuals with disabilities, then that's definitely going to be a problem as well. So, and I had just provided on the slide another example of successfully completing 20 customer service calls per hour. Let's say if you're in a telemarketing or a call center type environment. Moving on to slide 17, in general, job functions and job tasks are typically essential if it can fall under one of three categories. If the position exists for the performance of that function, then more than likely it's going to be considered essential. So for example, if you work for a magazine or a newspaper and you have a position that's a proofreader, the essential function of that job would be proofreading. By definition, that job is defining that job task, and it exists to perform that. So if you have someone that's unable to do proofreading activities, then they're most likely not qualified for the position that you're advertising. If for some reason there's a limited number of employees that can perform the function, and it therefore can't be reassigned, typically a function would be considered essential. So again, as an example, if you have, let's say, a laboratory environment where it's a restricted movement, only certain individuals are cleared to go into that laboratory, and there's a limited number of people within that environment. If you only have one or two people, it's hard to reassign job tasks if there just aren't a lot of people around to be able to do it. So it potentially creates a burden if you're shifting too many job tasks to one or two other people. They suddenly feel like, wait a minute, why am I being picked on because this individual is not able to do this task? So there is a little bit of equity that needs to happen there as well. So that is a recognition that if there's a limited number of employees that can perform the function, it is considered essential. The other thing is that the function is specialized and requires certain expertise to perform it. So for example, during my time with the ADA centers, we had a caller who was a rocket scientist. He truly was he had a PhD in astrophysics, and he worked for one of the federal scientific agencies in a laboratory setting. And the work that he was doing was highly specialized and obviously required very specific expertise to be able to do the tasks. And unfortunately, in this situation, the gentleman had multiple sclerosis, and it reached a point where he had to make the decision whether to continue working in that environment with the side effects of his MS that often resulted in fatigue and those kinds of things because the functions of his job were so specialized and his expertise was so specific. There weren't other people within the organization that could share some of his job tasks, or they could look at reassignment of those quote unquote peripheral job tasks in any way. So on slide 18, some further evidence of essential that can be used if you're an employer trying to make the determination, is this truly an essential function of the position that I'm looking at? Ultimately, it is the employer's judgment and decision whether a task is deemed essential or not. So ultimately, you as an employer are going to be the final say. However, it is important to be able to back that up, so to speak. And some areas that you can look at is obviously the amount of time performing the function. If you have an employee that's doing something and they're spending 40 to 50 to 60% of their workday doing a certain job task, that's evidence that that job task is fairly essential. So for example, that receptionist position we talked about earlier, the job task is to receive individuals in person, via phone, via email, and if they're spending the majority of their day doing that, that is very much an essential function of that job. However, if a task is infrequently performed, are there serious consequences if it's not performed when it's needed? So, for example, when we're not under a global pandemic, I travel quite frequently, and I assure you, I never need my airline pilot to prove to me that they can do a successful crash landing. However, I rest easier in the belly of the airplane knowing that they have the ability and skills to do a crash landing. And if they can't, or there's a reason why they're not able to perform that task, it is a very serious consequence if it's not performed when it's needed. So you could have a pilot that never has to crash land outside of training, but that would still be an essential function of that job, the ability to do that successfully and safely to protect the passengers as well as the crew and staff on the plane. For those of you that are dealing with union situations, you can also look at terms of collective bargaining agreements. Oftentimes, the union has negotiated such specifics that you can look to those collective bargaining agreements to identify the job tasks that are considered essential versus marginal for positions that are administered under that collective bargaining agreement. Another area or evidence of the essentialness of a job function, work smarter, not harder, folks. If you have other employees in the same position, look what they do. Do a little bit of job shadowing. Spend some time watching them work and talking to them about how they do their job. And oftentimes you can help figure out how essential tasks are, again, based on how much time they spend on it, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can also take into account the nature of the work operation or organizational structure. So again, like we mentioned earlier, if there's a limited number of individuals that are available to do things, that's part of the work operation and organizational structure, et cetera, et cetera. And then the last thing is that you can obviously look to any written job descriptions as designating job tasks as essential versus marginal. We're going to talk a lot more in depth about this shortly, so I won't go into too much detail there. So, getting to the idea of your disability law compliance and also your disability inclusion and diversity strategies within your organization, why should we even go to the effort of identifying essential job functions? Probably one of the biggest reasons is because you want to avoid inconsistent and unfair employment decisions. So if you've identified and outlined what the essential functions are for the positions within your organization, everyone's on the same page. Everyone understands what the expectations are. And it's a lot harder to treat individuals differently, whether disability is at play or not, if everyone's starting from the same foundation and building from there. It also allows us as employers to define the positions within our organization. It gives us parameters for managing, which is a hugely important tool. And again, it helps everyone understand, both your supervisors as well as your employees, the expectations for all of the different positions. And consequently, it's going to help supervisors and managers, the folks on the front line, with their performance management duties. So you can look at the performance of an individual, and if they are performing those essential job functions, that is going to benefit both the individual as well as the manager, because it's clearly laid out, and you can assess their performance based on that outline of essential job functions. So some best practices to keep in mind as we move on to the next topic. As an individual who works in this field and does this work quite often with organizations, both large and small, I've picked up some strategies and advice from folks over the years that are considered global best practice when it comes to identifying and communicating about essential job functions. And that's where some of these best practices come from that I'm going to share through the webinar today. So some things to keep in mind. It's really important as we're having this conversation, and as you're taking this back to your organization and figuring out what you want to do with it, to have kind of a strategy in place on what to do as you start these conversations. So one thing that I always recommend is kind of doing what's often called a brain dump. So you identify the position that you're talking about, and write down all of the different tasks that position is responsible for. And this can be, 20 items. It could be, 100 items, depending on what the position is. But it's kind of just getting everything out there. And then what you do is you take that list of tasks and you group them into major functional areas. So for example, I've already mentioned a cashier position in a retail setting. They're going to have a lot of different activities and tasks that they do throughout a shift. But oftentimes, a lot of those tasks fall under an umbrella or a category of a major function area. So for example, I mentioned the ability to provide effective customer service. That's going to be done in a lot of different ways. That's going to be done by interacting and communicating with the customer. That's going to be done through timely processing of the order. That's going to be done through bagging the materials or packaging them so that they can be carried from the retail setting or the store. But all of those are falling under a major function area of providing effective customer service. Then there's also the ability to operate work equipment. So they need to be able to use the scanner on the register. They need to be able to use the register itself. They need to be able to troubleshoot if there's a problem with the receipt paper. They need to be able to change it or get it unstuck, or various other tasks. So again, those are various different job tasks, but they all fall under one major function area, which is the ability to utilize that work equipment. So you can start to group your essential job functions into these major function areas. And then what you can do is put those major function areas, once you get them all sorted, in an order of importance. because, again, based on evidence of how much time they spend doing tasks, or the consequences if they're even done infrequently, what's the severity of them not being able to be performed, taking into account organizational structure and the organization function. You can start to rank the importance and putting those in order of importance. And then you want to talk about how much time the individual or the position is spending on each of those major functions. And that helps you also determine, again, if it's an essential function or not, based on the amount of time that's invested in the activity. One thing to always keep in mind, I think all of us that have a job description, I think this is probably lurking somewhere within all of our job descriptions, is the bullet point of other duties as assigned. That is not a job function. That is a catch-all phrase that sort of provides a CYA for employers that in case we missed anything, oh, by the way, you have to do anything else that we can come up with. But that is not measurable. You cannot, measure someone's performance management on other duties as assigned, and it does not provide the specificity that you need to have to be able to justify a task being an essential job task or an essential job function. It's okay to have that type of catch-all, but keep in mind that in terms of, if for some reason a complaint gets filed against you for disability discrimination, you will have a difficult time defending the other duties as assigned as an essential job function. The other thing to keep in mind, and the EEOC is very specific in their guidance on this, is that as you are hiring and having interviews or conversations with job candidates, it's very important to outline what the requirements of the position are, getting into detail about the job tasks, both essential and marginal, and asking the question, can you perform the essential functions of the position with or without reasonable accommodation? That's a question that's not forcing disclosure. Obviously, it's opening up the conversation potentially if they would choose to disclose a hidden disability at that time. But it's consistency for your talent acquisition that every candidate is being screened for their ability and their qualification of being able to perform the essential functions of a job with or without accommodation. So that should become just part of the script during your talent acquisition process. And that's training that you can do with your hiring staff and managers, so that creates that consistency within your organization. So I am going to take a breath, if that is okay, and if it's all right with you, Nancy, I will turn it over if we have any questions that have popped up during the first section of the training. I will take those now, so let me know.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jana. That was a lot of great information. We do have a couple of questions to follow up on some of your points. One question is, you talked a little bit about quantifiable job functions that are designated as essential job functions. How can employers determine if a quantifiable function is quote unquote actually necessary?
Well, as I said, ultimately it is the employer's judgment. Obviously though, in cases where a charge is filed with the EEOC or State Fair Employment Practice Agency, you would need to be able to support that with evidence. So, you'll have to take into account organizational features in terms of, what are the production standards within the facility, so to speak. So for example, I've recently worked with a couple of major manufacturing distribution centers. And the analysis that we did was looking at, okay, how realistically, how many shipments do they need to get out in an hour, in a day, in a shift? And how does that translate if we talk about splitting that up between different employees that are working on that shift, or those kinds of things. So it is okay to look at those business realities and business necessities when identifying that. However, to be really honest, sometimes it's just kind of a trial and error sort of thing. You put a quantifiable standard in place and monitor it and see if it's a realistic level or not. And you may need to change it moving forward. So for example, if you're in a call center and you tell people, you need to do 20 service calls an hour, and you start to do some trend analysis and you notice that calls are taking longer than you anticipated, then you may need to adjust that number, regardless if it's a disability issue or not, because people aren't able to get off of calls as quickly as you were hoping. So sometimes it is that, sort of trial and error, see what sticks, have a little bit of flexibility with yourselves as well as, with your employees, regardless of disability. So that's some of the ways that you can make sure that they truly are, actually a quantity that's realistic and measurable within your organization.
Great, thanks. We have another question about something you talked about to try to sort out the distinction between essential and marginal functions. The factor of how many people are available to do it, and if there are a limited number of individuals available, it might indicate a more essential function. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what that might really look like, or what that really means in terms of a limited number of people?
Sure. For better or worse, since its passage in 1990, the ADA and related regulations have always recognized business realities in its expectations for compliance. And one of the key components of that is the fact that as an organization, you have limited human resources. You only have so many people in a position, in a department, in a location, et cetera, to be able to do job tasks. So what you need to make sure, when you're determining if the essentialness of a job task, is taking into account that if you're assigning something a marginal or peripheral designation and therefore shifting it around or reassigning it to other individuals within the department or the location, that you're not creating an overly burdensome situation for other employees. So that is one business reality that comes into play is, okay, if you only have 2 or 3 people doing this particular position, you're going to have a lot more tasks that may be considered essential because there's just limited human resources that are available to do these tasks between the 2 or 3 individuals that are there. For organizations that are larger and have a lot more flexibility, that may be a different situation. But again, the reality is that as an organization, we can take into account those factors based on very real practical characteristics of how we operate as an organization. And so that's a component to it. Again, there's a lot of different examples that I can give, but it's really the ability that, as an organization, we have the expectation to do this work, and we have X number of people available to do the work necessary to meet those objectives. And so how do we distribute that work realistically within that group of individuals so that tasks are done in an equitable way that doesn't create burdens or adverse impact on other employees, including individuals with disabilities.
Great, and very practical advice. We have another question, and this is sort of a scenario that gets at this issue of sorting out the what versus the how, perhaps. The scenario is we've got a janitor who's allergic to bleach. The manager wants to designate the ability to use bleach as an essential function because we need to remove some mold and mildew in the environment. So do you have thoughts on that?
That is really getting into the designation between the what versus the how. So the essential job task needs to be the what. And in this situation, the what would be, successfully removing mold or other environmental contaminants in the facility. How an individual does that can be done in different ways. And as all of us are learning in the era of coronavirus, there are lots of different disinfectants and cleaning agents that are out there. So if you have someone who's allergic to bleach, there probably most likely is an alternative that can help remove that mold and other contaminants that is not bleach. The other issue, of course, gets into the conversation of, is there personal protective equipment or PPE that allows an individual who might be allergic to a cleaner the ability to use it and not be exposed in a way that's harmful to their health. So in this situation, it's very dangerous, I think, to try and say that using a specific chemical is an essential job function. It's because that is very specific. Instead, what you need to do is take a step back and identify the task that you're trying to perform, which is that removal of the mold or contaminant, and then identify what are some different ways that we can do that. Bleach is one option, but there's most likely a lot of other options. So again, you need to focus on the what, not the how, in this situation.
Great, thanks. We do have one comment.
Okay.
Not a question, but a comment. And
okay.
Then you let me know if you feel like you need to move on. But I will share this comment that was shared. The individual says, another reason that I think it's helpful to employers to identify and distinguish between essential and marginal functions is to help you attract the best talent. Because if you're kind of calling everything essential, you might actually discourage or eliminate a highly qualified candidate because you've thrown in a bunch of what really are marginal functions into your material, making an individual who may not be able to do those marginal functions assume that they're unqualified for a position and they might be the best candidate that you had. So that was an interesting comment.
Yeah, absolutely. Great thought, and thank you to whoever shared that. It's absolutely important because obviously, as a job seeker, we have such difficulties, making that impression on a potential employer. For those of you that are in HR and talent acquisition, I'm sure you've heard some of the statistics that you have, 5 seconds with your cover letter or resume to make an impression or those kinds of things. So on the one hand, it's important that as a job candidate, you're able to make yourself stand out. But then on the other hand, because especially, and I think moving forward, we'll see this even more, as we have more candidates applying for positions, trying to find the most qualified and the best individual to fill that position, we want to make sure as employers we're positioning ourselves well to be able to truly identify who that candidate is. And one way we do that is through clearly outlining what the job tasks are and how we delineate essential versus marginal. So yes, absolutely, that is a great comment, and thank you for that. Nancy, if it is okay, I will go ahead and take the mic back, and we'll cover a little bit more and then open it up for some more questions. Okay, so let's dive into the concept of job requirements. So we've talked about the job tasks. That's the essential and marginal functions. So what are some of the job requirements? There's typically three categories that are often going to come into play and be discussed when we're talking about this. There's the summary of the position on slide 22, the essential functions, and then the job specifications and qualifications. So let's break those down a little bit into some specifics. On slide 23, the summary of the position is basically just that. It's typically a short, descriptive paragraph that outlines the reason for or function of the position within the organization. It's going to talk about, what purpose does it serve, what role does that position fill within the organization, how does it fit into the operations of your organization, and you can also include a brief overview of your organization if you'd like. I know some larger companies do that in particular. But it really is just a short, brief, descriptive paragraph or two that gives a summary of this job and what it means in the big scheme of things within an organization. So some examples, I always try to provide you with, some practicalities as well. On slide 24, I've given you a few examples. So using the firefighter again, a position summary that would work for this type of job would be, again, responding to fire alarms, medical emergencies, hazardous materials, urban rescue, and other calls to protect life and property, participate in fire prevention and training, and maintain the fire station and firefighting equipment. For a car sales associate, sell automobiles at car dealerships and help customers find the right purchase for their needs. Again, very brief, but it gives you a nice summary of what is the purpose of this position. Why are we hiring this individual? One last example for you, for a carpenter. They're responsible for designing, building, installing, and repairing structures, fixtures, furniture, and other items using different types of materials, including wood or steel. Again, a very high-level look at what is a carpenter position, what are the overall expectations for that, that individual or an individual who would be applying for or doing the work within that position. So again, on slide 25, another key component that comes into this conversation obviously is the essential job functions. And you may include performance standards that describe how you want the essential job functions to be completed. So, when you're coming up with job descriptions or job summaries, it is okay to go ahead and put some qualifiers on the essential job functions and describe to potential candidates and employees how you'd like things to work. Keeping in mind, though, you're evaluating their ability to perform the task, and how they're going to do that is going to look different depending on the individual. But some things that you can include as information about process, methods that they can use, techniques, procedures, or tools that they're using to complete the job. So for an example, as a carpenter, you can expect that they use both hand tools and power tools to do their work. Time. You can also specify how much time is allowed to perform a function if you'd like when you're listing your job requirements. Again, the quantity, how often a function is performed, and also quality, how success is measured. So you can, you can say that they need to work effectively with others or provide effective customer service or those kind of descriptors, so that, you do create a standard for performance, in the language that you're communicating with applicants and employees. So some examples of these that come from, real positions that we've been talking about today. So for the mail clerk, an essential job function, ensuring proper labeling and packaging for outgoing post. So again, that's getting into methods and techniques, those sorts of things. For the firefighter, you're responding to fire alarms with your assigned company. You're laying and connecting hose. You're maintaining pumping apparatus. You're holding nozzles and directing water streams. You're raising and climbing ladders. You're ventilating burning structures. You're entering buildings to evacuate occupants. Again, these are the essential functions, and you're giving some qualifiers to those tasks to be able to measure performance towards. For the car sales associate, you're communicating with your customers, and you're doing that via email, telephone, and in person. For your carpenter, they're going to utilize the chisels, planes, again, those hand tools, as well as power tools to repair and erect structures. So again, you're able to get into some detail in the job requirements that give a little bit of description of the expectation of how you want those tasks to be performed. The other component of your job requirements, so we've got the position summary, the essential functions, and the description of those, is the job specifications. And these are all of those other types of expectations to consider if someone is qualified for the position or not. Again, it's qualifications, skills, ability to meet job descriptions. If you have educational criteria, they need to have a certain degree or certain educational training, any necessary certification or licensure requirements. So for example, if you're hiring a plumber and you expect them to be licensed and bonded within the state where you're operating, those would be a job specification. If there's any specialized knowledge or experience that you want that person to have, whether it's knowledge of a certain type of software program or certain type of work equipment. If you have someone who's working in a warehouse and you want them to be a forklift operator, that's a very specialized knowledge or experience that you may be looking for that you can list as a job specification. And then there's also any environmental, psychological, or physiological requirements of the job. So if you're in a warehouse setting and you can have huge fluctuations in temperature in the building, you may want to include that in the job specifications as a heads up for individuals who may have temperature issues, like someone with MS who might be sensitive to cold or hot, either direction. So this would be an opportunity for you to list some of those conditions that exist within the organization that you're operating. If you're in an office setting, obviously you could describe that for a potential candidate or employee so that they understand what the requirements are for that type of office setting. So some examples, again, mail clerk would be the proficiency with sorting machines. That's a specialized knowledge or skill and equipment that they have the ability to use. For a firefighter, from an educational training perspective, a job specification could be successful completion of the fire academy or firefighter training school. For the car sales associate, strong customer service and negotiation skills. That would be a specification that would be very targeted to this position because of the environment that this person would be working in. And then as an example for a carpenter, the individual may work in cramped spaces and be exposed to variable weather conditions if they're working inside or outside and those kinds of things. So again, these are just some examples that provide you some context on information to share when you're talking about the job requirements. So you've got the position summary, just a quick summary statement of why the position exists, why, what the function is within the organization. You have those job tasks, those essential functions with, description. And then now, of course, you have the job specifications, which are kind of all the extra stuff that the person needs to fulfill to be considered qualified for the position. A lot of information to communicate, but very important to communicate it accurately for a lot of different talent acquisition reasons. So I'm going to take a break for just one sec. I do have at least one question that came in via chat directly to me. And so one of the questions is if a quantifiable essential function like moving a particular number of boxes tends to screen out people with mobility disabilities, but not people who are deaf, is the essential function a problem? The short answer is it depends. As we all know, that's our favorite answer within the National ADA Network. You have to look at moving the boxes from point A to point B. That is the essential job function. Is that, you have to look at, your evidence of essentialness. Is that truly essential? And are there reasonable accommodations available that would allow someone with mobility impairment, whether that's a back injury or someone who's a wheelchair user, I mean, it can run the gamut, to perform that task. So it's a twofold analysis. First, you have to look at, is it truly an essential job function, being able to move that material? The fact of the matter is that in some positions, that movement is definitely essential. If you are in a warehouse setting, you need to be able to move product around. How you move that product can be done in different ways, whether it's a hand truck or trolley, whether it's a forklift, whether it's picking it up by hand and carrying it across the floor. There's a lot of different things. And the reality is that for some positions, there are physical requirements that may disqualify individuals with certain types of disabilities who physically are unable to perform that task, even with accommodation. That's not screening out or potentially screening out entire classes of candidates. The business realities point to the fact that that is what's required. So an example of this, I know it's a pretty extreme one, but there are certain positions for public safety reasons that almost automatically disqualify individuals with certain types of disability. So for example, the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, they've actually put restrictions on individuals who work in control towers at airports. So these are the individuals that we see, in movies and film and television shows, with the headsets, who are up in the control tower, controlling the traffic flow of airports and air travel. Those individuals cannot have a seizure disorder. And the FAA has made that decision for public safety reasons that, unfortunately, if someone has a seizure during their shift and is unable to perform the tasks of their job, that creates a public safety issue. So in that situation, the reality of the position is that having a seizure disorder would create safety problems, and so therefore the FAA has determined that that is, that's a restriction on that position. That's not discriminatory under the ADA because it's legitimate safety and direct threat issues that are coming into play, and that's why those kinds of limitations are put into place. So if a job is physical in some way, that is the nature of the job potentially, and therefore it wouldn't be screening out individuals who physically can't do the job if they can't meet those physical requirements. That's the reality of it. And then another question that came in, who are the best people to come up with the essential functions of a job? Should this be kept within the HR department? The short, again, please don't laugh, but the short answer again is it depends. It really depends on the organization. Oftentimes this is a process that involves a lot of stakeholder groups. I've worked with clients, in recent years where we involve human resources, we involve the talent acquisition department, we involve health and safety. It really depends. Oftentimes it's and I'll actually talk about the job analysis process coming up, and we'll talk a little bit about who to involve in that process. But you often can get really good input from various parts of the organization. However, best practice is typically the ultimate job description and the ultimate list of essential and marginal job functions will most likely live with human resources or talent acquisition, because if that's just practical, you've got to have some officer in charge, so to speak. So that's typically best practice globally. Where this ends up falling is within HR ultimately, but you can involve lots of different parts of the organization to determine what those are. I am going to go ahead and push forward and talk a little bit about job analysis, and then we'll open it up for some conversation and questions to wrap up. So we are on slide 30, and as I mentioned, job analysis is a tool that you can use within your organization if you haven't done this already to help you determine essential and marginal job functions, job requirements, specifications, and operational issues that are happening within your organization to help make sure that you're creating equitable job tasks and job standards. It's a strategic planning tool and an investigative process, and it's very much a process of gathering, examining, and interpreting data about a position's tasks and responsibilities. So it's a very targeted activity that helps you as an organization strategically identify what your positions are and then take the next steps in determining what those positions actually do and how to communicate that effectively. It's going to include specifics about the work site, an individual's workstation or work location, and the activities that they're doing during a typical shift. The goal of job analysis is to have a detailed analysis of the tasks and responsibilities, risks and hazards, functions and duties, tools and equipment that are being used in a position. And it also helps you identify the expected output. What are the results of this person doing this job? Are they producing a certain number of widgets on the manufacturing floor in an hour? Are they completing data entry using a computer to help with claims processing? Are they fighting fires and providing fire prevention training? You know, it helps you identify, okay, what are we really expecting to get out of this individual's or this position? Really important, though, as we start to talk about what job analysis is and how it works, it's very important to keep in mind that as I'm suggesting some of these strategies, it's an evaluation of the job, the position, not any specific person who's doing that job. So this isn't a performance management activity. You're not going in and rating, you know, an individual employee to see how well they're doing their job. You're just looking at what they're doing and taking a deep dive into trying to figure out how, you know, what, again, all of those risks and hazards, functions and duties, tools and equipment through that analysis and data collection process. So you're focusing on the job, not any one person who's doing that job. Slide 31, some areas that are typically covered or looked at and data collected for are mental and physical tasks that are involved, how the job's going to be done, including methods and different kinds of equipment and tools that are used to do the job tasks, the reason that the job exists, including job goals, purpose, those sorts of things, and how they relate to other positions within your organization. So this is an opportunity for you to analyze kind of how the pieces fit together in your organizational puzzle. And then obviously the qualifications that are needed, like training, skills, personality traits, those kinds of things. Activities that are typically involved in job analysis, and this can really vary depending on the organization. Obviously, for larger organizations, you're going to need to do a lot of different things to collect data. You might not need to do that in larger or smaller organizations or smaller departments. So this is very much a you pick and choose these activities based on what's reasonable for the organization that you're working with. One thing that you do is you track the different job tasks. And you can do that in a variety of ways, and I'll talk to you about some of those activities in just a second. You also look at how much time is being spent on each task. Then you're going to want to observe the employees performing the job. So this is where the job shadowing comes in. And it's gonna look funny because you're probably gonna have a tablet or a clipboard or some kind of note-taking device so that you can make observations and take pictures and write things down or type things up, whatever works best for you. Oftentimes it includes interviews. So you're going to sit down and talk to employees and their supervisors and other individuals in the organization that interact with a position to get a feel of what's being done in that job. And then you're also going to compare the position to other jobs in the same department or job grade or family. So it's very much, you're looking at how it fits, again, into, the puzzle pieces of the organization that you work with. So the ideal outcome of a job analysis on slide 33 is you're going to have a thorough understanding of the job tasks, including those essential job functions. You're going to be able to list through all of those different data collection activities all of the duties and responsibilities of a job. And then you'll be able to split out about, guesstimation how much time is spent for each group of tasks. And then obviously also the other job specifications and job skills that are needed to perform it. And also the conditions under which the work's completed. So because you're in the field, so to speak, doing job shadowing, observing how positions or how jobs are being done, you're going to understand better the environment that it's happening in, what those conditions are, what kind of physical demands there are, what mental demands are in, are there for employees. So it allows you to really collect a lot of data that's going to inform your ability to not only identify essential and marginal job functions, but also potentially help with job performance, improvements for employee morale, those kinds of things that are much bigger picture kinds of issues within an organization. So some best practices, I mentioned I was going to give you some examples of ways that you can collect some of this data. These are again, can vary. Like I said, I work with clients, various industries, various sizes, and when we do a job analysis, it's going to be very customized to the organization and its needs, how its employees work. So for some situations, I can do interviews on the phone or via Zoom or those sorts of things. In other cases, I need to be on the ground, in a facility watching how things happen. So, I visit distribution centers, I visit warehouses, I visit, call centers so that I can watch, because I don't do the job and I don't know the details. And if you're in HR, even within the organization, you don't know the details or how each position within your organization is done. So it really, these kinds of strategies, it's going to really depend on your organization, what you need to do and how you do it. A few best practices, though, that are often good data collection tools for you. First, have employees complete job analysis forms. And at this stage in the game, there are lots of them available online. Do not recreate the wheel. These are things that you can find and adapt to your organization, and it allows you to collect some of this data in a way that's easy for you to digest and use moving forward as you develop job descriptions and things like that. Interview employees. Again, that is a huge component of job analysis, is talking to people who do the jobs to find out how they do it, why they do things, the order that they do things, how they interact with other people, those kinds of issues. Using log sheets. This can really help if you have, on a 2 or 3 shifts, you have someone kind of keep a log of what they do and how much time they're spending on it, you can refer to that, and that helps supplement some of the observation that you're going to do. Desk audits are often used in job analysis, and it allows you to do that observation and those kinds of things. Again, interviewing supervisors, managers, and other employees that interact with the position is important, because that gives you that idea of how the organizational structure is impacted by a position's job tasks. And then, again, it's okay to compare the position to other positions and get that analysis as well. So the ultimate goal is that as you do this job analysis, you've collected all of this data, you've identified these functions. Ultimately, your goal is that you want to develop a usable, flexible, readable job description for the position. And on slide 36, it's important that I point something out. The ADA does not require employers to develop or maintain job descriptions. Ironically, I've been doing this work for close to 20 years now, and I have had a job description one time in those 20 years. So the ADA doesn't require you as an employer to have job descriptions, but for those of you in human resources, you can I hopefully agree with my statement that job descriptions are a hugely effective tool that you can use. So yes, the ADA doesn't require them, but it sure makes sense from an organizational management perspective to have these job descriptions in place. They're helpful because they're going to help you identify candidates that can perform the tasks of the position. As the individual commented earlier during the part of the Q&A session, it also allows you to identify the best candidates to fill your positions because you're able to communicate what the expectations are in an effective way. It helps you determine your salary ranges and levels and grades depending on how your organization works. It helps you establish your job titles. For better or worse, people need to know who they are within an organization and what they can put on a business card. And so this process and having a job description in place helps you establish those job titles. It also helps create job goals and objectives for individuals within your organization. And hugely important, it allows you to do effective performance evaluations. If you have expectations that are outlined in the job description, you can refer to those during your performance evaluations throughout the year and see what that person is doing in terms of meeting those expectations. How are they performing according to that? And then obviously, it is a powerful tool for disability law compliance. If you have a job description in place and you have someone who's claiming that they've been discriminated against, you can point to your job description and the outlined job tasks and talk about their qualifications, their ability to perform those tasks. Are they a qualified individual? So again, it's a risk tool that you can use to have in place. On slide 37, some basics for you to keep in mind, and there's a lot of theory about job descriptions, so this is very much the tip of the iceberg. But a few things to keep in mind. A job description should be an objective listing of the job title, the tasks, and the responsibilities in a job. It needs to be a broad statement of purpose and scope, duties, and responsibilities. It's really important as employers that we avoid getting too far into the weeds and too detailed in our job descriptions, because that paints both the employee and us as an organization into a bit of a corner because we've gotten so specific, there's not a lot of flexibility built into the position, and that creates a risk for us as employers. So keep in mind that it's that broad statement, and it's focusing on the what that needs to be performed, not the how. in a lot of ways, because we want to make sure that we're giving our employees the flexibility to figure out how they're going to do the job most effectively. So we want to make sure that we're giving them those broad expectations and then allowing them to figure out individually how they're going to best do that. It's important that we're using clear, concise, non-technical language. We want to avoid jargon. We want to avoid acronyms. We also want to, avoid gender-specific language. Your pronouns like she and he. It's important not to assume that a secretary is going to be a woman, and so you want to make sure that you're not assigning gender specific language to job descriptions. Also, sometimes proprietary names that you use in your industry can be confusing for someone, particularly in entry-level positions, that they don't know what you're talking about. And so, you're screening out people that may be great employees if you train them. So it's really important, again, to avoid that jargon and those kinds of things. Also, obviously, you want to avoid any language that screens out or tends to screen out individuals with disabilities. So, for example, when you're talking about communication, it's really important to use the word communicate, because you can communicate in a lot of different ways. You can speak, you can use sign language, you can use assistive technologies, computer-based interface, text messaging, those sorts of things. So don't say that you have to be able to talk, because you're screening out individuals who may be deaf or hard of hearing or have a speech impairment, and talking is not going to be the best way for them to communicate. So again, making sure that you're using language that's inclusive and not potentially screening out individuals with disabilities. So towards that end, I've included in the PowerPoint a chart of quote-unquote ADA compliant language. And this is just some examples of some things I've put together over the years that often come up as a job demand, and language that's typically used, and better ways that you can communicate that in your job descriptions. So for example, a lot of physicians have a demand of being able to sit or stand for long periods of time, whether that's at a desk, a cash register, a sorting station, whatever the case may be. Instead of using the words sit or stand, you can instead say be able to maintain a stationary position. Because again, someone can, maybe is in a wheelchair, and they're not going to be able to stand per se, but they can still work at a station and maintain a stationary position for a certain amount of time. So again, this is a much more inclusive type of language. Another example, climbing. You often see, the ability to climb ladders or climb stools. Instead of using the word climb, use words like ascend or descend. So you have to be able to ascend to a higher level and descend. Whether that's a mezzanine or a ladder in a storage room, how that looks is going to be different. And then another example, seeing. You have to be able to see things. Well, using the term see, or using the word see, has a tendency to screen out entire categories of people with disabilities. So use words like detect, perceive, identify, recognize, inspect, assess, because there's lots of different ways that you can do that activity, that demand, that is not necessarily seeing in a traditional sense. So these are just some examples of ADA compliant language, substitution of words that can be really important. As we all know, words do matter. And so this helps you craft job descriptions that are usable as well as compliant, so to speak, in terms of your ADA compliance requirements. On 39, slide 39, I just provided a quick outline of what typically a job description looks like. Again, job descriptions are can vary widely between organizations, and it's really up to you to determine what you need. But typical contents are a job title, the work location, where the work's going to be performed, the department or section within the organization that it falls under. Oftentimes there's information about the supervisor, who this position reports to, and likewise who reports to this position if it has supervisory or management responsibilities. The objective, or again, that summary kind of statement. Principal duties and responsibilities. I recommend, you don't have to, but as global best practice, I recommend using the terms essential and marginal functions. Clearly outline them, clearly label them, and it makes it a lot easier to point to it and say, this is an essential function of this job, if we've labeled it that way from the get-go. If there's any special working conditions, like the ability to travel or the ability to work from home or those kinds of things. And then, of course, the job specifications and qualifications like education and training and skills, et cetera, et cetera. Some best practices to keep in mind, and then we'll turn it over for questions. On slide 40, really important, keep your job descriptions up to date. Whether it's doing an annual review, going back and looking at, but have some sort of schedule that you go back periodically and check, put your toe in the water and make sure that your job description is, still accurate and still reflects the needs of the organization. Use your job descriptions to attract candidates, not to weed out employees you don't want. This should be a talent acquisition tool, not a impediment to screening out individuals that you don't want within your organization. So craft it with that in mind. Another big thing is, I've worked with clients where I've come up with job descriptions for them, literally for 10,000 positions and rewritten every single job description. And the decision was made not to share those with anybody. And at the time, and I still believe, that is so silly, because if you're going to do a job description, give it out, distribute it, give it to applicants, give it to your employees so that everyone's on the same page, we all have the same foundation, and we all understand what the expectations for positions are. It also allows for the hiring and firing process to be able to communicate with someone and say, this is the job that you're applying for. We want you to make sure that this is what you want to do. Here's a description of it. So that communication is key. You also want to make sure that you're maintaining internal consistency, that everyone is using the same job description, the same version of the job description, et cetera, et cetera. And then it's also important to include some language, I use the term disclaimer language, about possible updates. So, you can use language like, this can be changed at any time, something like that, because the fact of the matter is that, business realities can shift pretty quickly. Just think about, what we're going through right now, where suddenly we're working from home, whether the organization believes that jobs can be, done from home or not. So it's important to build some of that flexibility into your job descriptions, so that as an employer you have a little bit of flexibility to review these and go back and look at them periodically. I've got some resources, but I am going to turn it over to you, Nancy, to do wrap-up and questions.
Okay, great, Janet. We do have a couple of questions. One, we have a question about how to sort of analyze the types of functions that are related to workplace emergencies and responding to that. The types of duties that may happen rarely or maybe never at all, like these are assignments if the fire alarm goes off, that sort of thing. How would you sort of analyze that in terms of, are those kinds of duties essential? Are they marginal? Are they in that catch-all other duties as assigned category?
That's a tough one to answer in a categorical way, quite honestly, because it really does depend on the organization. So for organizations that are large, that have a lot of human resources, there's a lot of people, you may be able to distribute some of those tasks across several people or, a few key people. Obviously, safety under the ADA, safety supersedes everything. So, in cases of emergency, and obviously preparing and prepping for that emergency situation, it is okay to designate individuals within the organization to sort of be key individuals for deployment of your disaster plan. However, there is some recognition that there may need to be some flexibility built into your plan to allow, let's say, for example, you have, you're in a multi-story building and you've decided to identify floor captains who are kind of the officer in charge on each floor. Well, if you have someone who, one of your female employees is the floor captain for her floor and she's pregnant, she may not be able to physically do some of the expectations during her pregnancy. So you want to have a backup in place, some redundancy for the floor captain in those situations. Just like you would if somebody was on vacation or if somebody had changed positions and was no longer on that floor. So I think it's important that when you're doing emergency planning and health and safety kinds of activities, you're creating that redundancy. But also there needs to be some flexibility there, that if you have someone with a disability who may have difficulty performing those duties, that there most likely will need to be backup or someone else that can take on those duties. The only exception to that is going to be, obviously, if the position is in the health and safety department and it exists to perform those tasks, then at that point it could likely become an essential job function. So it's really going to depend on the situation. And if you have something specific in mind, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to chat with you about specifics for anything.
Thanks, Jana. I think maybe we have time for just this one last quick question before we need to move on and give folks their final information. But we have a question from someone who says this, you're saying that you should be asking every candidate this question: can you perform the essential functions with or without reasonable accommodation? Is that a best practice or is that a legal requirement?
It is a best practice, and in guidance material that the EEOC has published in recent years, that is a recommendation that they make. It is not a legal requirement, it is not a regulatory requirement, but it is a suggestion for good management and an effective way to communicate the expectations related to essential functions.
For those of you who registered for a certificate of participation and/or continuing education credit, or if you'd like to register for a certificate or credit, refer to the webinar description for information about how to request the certificate and/or credit.
We do always include the ADA National Network, so if this is not a part of your arsenal and your toolkit, definitely reach out to your regional center because it is a great resource to have for answering your questions. Some other organizations to keep in mind that I've included, and all of these links are embedded in the presentation, but I always include the EEOC. They've got some great guidance documents on their website, ODEP, or the Office of Disability Employment Policy, the Job Accommodation Network, Cornell University, the Tang Employment and Disability Institute, and then Society of Human Resource Management has some really great resources available related to job functions and job descriptions as well. If nothing else, you've had a chance to chat with me for a little bit this afternoon. Feel free to reach out if you have questions that I wasn't able to get to today, or if you've got specific situations within your organization that you'd like to chat about. I'm available. To be honest, these days it's a lot easier to get me via email, but I did also provide my phone number as well if you'd like to reach out via phone. Other than that, you can also follow my business page on Facebook. I have employment and Title I related updates. Try to get them every day, and if not, every couple days. And I'm also on LinkedIn as well if you'd like to connect that way. Otherwise, I want to say thank you to Nancy and Maynor and everyone at the Region 3 Mid-Atlantic ADA Center, and thank you to the participants.
And thank you so much, Jana, for sharing your expertise today, and thank everyone for joining us today. And please do contact us if you have further questions. Enjoy the rest of your day.